Welcome to Short Talks from the Hill, a research and economic impact podcast from the University of Arkansas. My name is Todd Price. After a stressful day, who hasn't torn through a bag of potato chips or eaten an entire pint of ice cream? Stress eating is real. What drives us to stress eat? Is it our bodies, our minds, or has our culture taught us to seek comfort in unhealthy food? Today, on Short Talks, our guest is Grant Shields, an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological Science, who studies the way stress affects how we think, how we make decisions, and our health. Professor Shields has recently been reviewing what we know about stress eating and what we still need to understand. Stress eating can affect not just our personal health, stress eating may also have broader economic impacts. Grant Shields, welcome to Short Talks, and hopefully being a guest on a podcast will not be too stressful.
Thanks, Todd. It's great to be here.
Well, let's start with a basic definition. What is stress? And are you defining stress in the way that aligns with how we define stress in everyday life?
I define stress as the subjective experience that occurs when we perceive our situation, broadly defined, this can include like social situation or extended in time, broadly defined to be unpredictable, uncontrollable, presenting a real or perceived threat to the physical or social self, and a couple other things. Stress is really characterized by a specific biological response. It is probably partially because of that response that stress does what it does to eating behavior and food choices.
Let's talk about eating in general then. Is it fair to say that most of us, given the choice, would prefer to eat unhealthy food? And why is self-regulation so important for healthful eating?
I think that there are probably some folks out there that may be exceptions to the norm. But by and large, I think that most of us would prefer to eat unhealthy foods. We've just gotten really good as a society about focusing in on those things that throughout our evolutionary past were most indicative of foods that would help us live longer. And so we find things that are easily digestible in terms of like providing quick energy to us, like sugar, very hyperpalatable, and same with fat. Fatty foods bring more calories per bite than anything else. So we like the both of those things. When we put them together, I think you would be hard-pressed to find somebody that doesn't occasionally enjoy a really nice piece of chocolate cake or something like that.
If we need to self-regulate and control ourselves to be good and eat healthy, what does stress do to that self-regulation?
We can talk about self-regulation in a lot of different ways. At its core, you can conceptualize self-regulation as a bit of a seesaw between things that we want to do and things that we know that we should in a long-term, goal-directed way. Stress can affect both sides of the seesaw. It can affect our reward processing and our negative emotionality. Both of those things are going to increase the I want to do the bad thing right now side of that seesaw. It also can affect the extent to which we can maintain our long-term goals and implement self-regulatory control processes to override the nasty emotions that we feel. Stress really monkeys with both sides of the equation. It's typically thought that it does so in the same way on either side, typically such that it makes that thing that we shouldn't do look a lot more appealing.
Does stress actually change how we taste and perceive foods?
There are some studies that do suggest so, yes. That research is not entirely consistent. It seems like stress can influence even like the minimum detectable thresholds that we need to perceive something as salty or sweet.
So that would mean that we would desire that more or recognize it more? What does changing that threshold do?
That's a tough question. Without knowing a whole lot more about how temporary, like transient changes in those thresholds lead to real eating behavior, it's tough to say. That's not my area of expertise. I do know enough about the addictions literature. When you can't experience the same level of reward from a substance, you might be tempted to take more of a substance to experience what had been, that same level of reward. Alternatively, though, it is possible that because we really like sugar, tasting more sugar might just kind of snowball into a greater consumption of it. I'm really not sure one way or the other how we might expect stress to influence average eating behavior and weight through that mechanism, but I think you could come up with some good arguments for either side.
What are the other, like, really important physiological and psychological factors that lead to stress eating and affect appetites when it comes to stress?
A lot of us engage in comfort eating, maybe even intentionally. We know that the chocolate cake makes us feel better while we're eating it, at least. Turns out, if you look kind of long term, once the chocolate cake is gone, tends not to have really helped that we ate it, but we can keep eating the chocolate cake. Encouraging comfort eating, maybe because of a cultural understanding around, well, I'm stressed. I feel like it's okay to eat this thing right now. That could be one mechanism. Stress also directly affects some of our physiological processes in ways that make us want food more. There's some evidence that stress increases, like the hunger hormone ghrelin and cortisol. People call it the stress hormone, cortisol. That's a misnomer, in my opinion. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. Its primary function is actually energetic. And what it does is mobilize our reserves such that our muscle and other forms of tissue have more glucose at the ready, if need be, for an extended exertion. And because of that, our systems that we have in place to kind of detect those reserves start sounding alarms saying, hey, we may need a little bit more glucose here.
Is comfort eating effective? I mean, should we do it? It sounds like if we just keep doing it and don't stop, it will work.
Can I say that I don't occasionally comfort eat, knowing what I know about the stress and eating behavior literature? Not at all. Should I comfort eat, knowing what I know about the stress and eating behavior literature? Not at all. It doesn't seem to be effective long term, but it is very effective in the moment. If you're dealing with some incredibly overwhelming negative affect, say, maybe don't feel too bad about eating that pint of ice cream, but in the types of negative affect that we typically experience from a stressor, yeah, it's probably not a good idea to eat the pint of ice cream.
It's not enough just to understand we want to eat this because we're stressed and this is not something we should do. Overcoming that sort of intellectual understanding that this is stress eating isn't enough to stop us typically.
Yeah. At least me.
Even you, and
Yeah.
you study this for a living.
Yeah.
We often think about stress just as something that we suffer as individuals. Losing a job can make us stressed. An upcoming test in school can make us stressed. But there are larger events that can stress a lot of people at once. A pandemic, an economic downturn. Do we see broad changes in the way people eat when these events occur?
We do. There are fewer studies on this than you might imagine. One of the only international stressors that's been really well studied with respect to this eating behavior and stress type of idea is the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know if you've heard kind of the joke about gaining the COVID-19. That's what that literature has found, that the pandemic was associated with a shift in food preferences. People tended to eat fast food and hyperpalatable food a little bit more. Maybe that's because they didn't want to go to the grocery store. And that shows kind of the complexity of considering these national stressors, at least in the situations in which it's been studied. Nations and populations tend to show the expected effects that you would think you would see from this kind of more micro lab experiment type of research.
Have there been any studies that show that it actually changes consumer habits in a way that you could measure? I mean, is it that broad?
So we do know that people ate fast food and takeout quite a bit more during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are some other more nuanced results that I can't quite recall offhand. I'm sure we all can remember ordering DoorDash a time or two during COVID when we frankly could have gone and picked up the food at the very least to save that $20. That's now why we have such a thriving delivery industry.
What are some other large questions that you still wonder about with stress and eating that researchers have not really worked out that you think are the things that we need to understand to really understand this phenomena better?
I think that I would love to see more work examining particular types of food choices and how those differ as a function of stress. Moving beyond hyperpalatable, is it the case that we see specific forms of hyperpalatable food consumption increase without seeing others? And even can we do away with the term hyperpalatable and really talk about high fat, high sugar, or high fat, high sodium, or things like that? It's been studied to a degree. There are some studies on this, but less so within kind of the larger economic types of studies, although there are, again, some studies that have done so. The literature on this is quite messy, actually.
Let's talk about your work in general. So, your research is focused on stress. Why? What brought you to this subject?
A couple reasons. I'm really particularly interested in the intersection between stress and cognition. What brought me to that research interest, you can talk about in a few different ways. One of them, it was just the intersection of the expertise that my earliest advisors had. And I saw that there wasn't as much work on the topic as you would expect, so I started to make that my area of interest. That's the pragmatic answer. The subjective answer that I feel is more accurate, even though I'm not sure how true this is, when I was working between undergrad and grad school in a group home, I saw youth, when they were stressed out, do things that they would really regret doing later on. And then I began to see some of the same things in me, right? Like I eat a pint of ice cream from time to time. Not quite to the same degree, I started to think, well, maybe this kind of failure of self-regulatory behavior under stress is something that is common and yet understudied. And so I want to study it.
Talk about some of the work that you've done so far. I mean, what are specifically some of the experiments you've done? And I know your graduate students also and your undergraduates also do experiments. So maybe talk about some of the work you've directed with them. What are the questions you're trying to answer there?
One study that we wrapped up pretty recently was examining how different things that happen to us during a stressful experience might influence how we remembered those experiences. In this case, we actually didn't stress anyone out. We just had them write about stressful events that had happened that contained specific characteristics. Either they did this or they didn't do that. And we wanted to see how it influenced like the types of information that people were retrieving about those memories. And we found some interesting results. Another one of my students right now is just finished putting together a study examining how stress influences a particular form of decision making. And before coming here, I actually just participated in it as a participant.
Is that something you do often?
I do ask my students to always have me be participant 0 in their studies. I want to make sure that everything is implemented correctly and everything kind of comes together as it should before we run other participants through it. I also feel like it's only fair if I'm asking somebody else to do this that I've done it myself. But again, we don't only do stress studies. So if you sign up for a study in my lab, you might not have any of these things happen to you.
Can you talk about what the experience was like of being in a subject just a few minutes ago in one of your students' experiments?
It's stressful. I'm all discombobulated.
I would never know. Can you talk about how you stress people in how do you induce stress in these experiments?
We induce stress by a number of different means. They are all means that you could experience in everyday life, just kind of walking around or in conversation with someone else. One of the most common ways that we induce stress is actually just interviewing people. We ask them to tell us about themselves. And people just don't like speaking about themselves for like a certain number of minute period. Some people do, and they're great at it, but most people, that's not the case. We use things that can heat or cool water to certain temperatures that people choose to get into anyways. So one of the stressors that we use, we heat water up to 115 degrees. Like you can walk around in that. It's not going to cause any tissue damage, but it really hurts. And so people don't like to have their arms submerged in water that warm for a few minute period. Things like that, minimal or risk or so, but they're particularly effective at making people feel less than ideal.
You've dedicated your research and your professional life to studying stress. Are you better at handling stress in your personal life than before?
I would say so. For a while, I don't think that I would have. But I have gotten to the point where I've learned the particular situations that are likely to elicit stress and how I can deal with those in ways that are maybe a bit more productive than I used to.
Excellent. Well, Grant, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been really fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Short Talks from the Hill is now available wherever you get your podcasts. For more information and additional podcasts, visit arkansasresearch.uark.edu, the home of science and research news at the University of Arkansas. Music for Short Talks from the Hill was written and performed by local musician Ben Harris.